So I've spent my entire career essentially stalking asthma. First in the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, then in rural villages in southwestern Alaska, and then in urban and rural India. Each time essentially trying to sneak up on the disease and catch it in a moment of weakness when it wasn't paying attention, and learn something about it that we could use against it. In 2004, I joined the Centers for Disease Control, hoping to carry out outbreak investigations of asthma. But I quickly encountered the limitations of public health data. We simply just had too little information, too late to marshal any kind of real effort against the disease. Since then, a few years later, I recognized that the potential for technology really to augment what I was doing. And I started experimenting, adding chips and sensors and radios to inhalers with the idea that we could track when and where a medication was used and then put that information to work. And today, I'm more excited than ever about the opportunities in mHealth, the huge potential and proliferation of the technology. We can and we are building technology that I think accomplishes a great deal of the work of illness, that makes it easier for patients and physicians to do a better job managing chronic diseases and so forth with less effort. But what I want to talk today about is kind of his unappreciated potential in mHealth. I want to recruit you to the game I've been playing my whole career, and that is something I think more meaningful and lasting. And it's the opportunity really we have to begin to prevent disease in populations. So I got to go down a little science path for a minute. In 1985, the first year that the cellular network was turned on, a physician epidemiologist named Jeffrey Rose, published this paper that became an instant landmark. It's called Sick Individuals and Sick Populations. And Rose basically showed that the causes of disease in an individual were not the same things that caused the overall rate of disease in a population. He made the point with this really famous figure, which shows the distribution of systolic blood pressure in two populations: Kenyan nomads, London civil servants. Rose showed that you could in each population, you could investigate why some people had higher blood pressure than others and come up with the same answer. That is, mostly genetic variation, some contribution of an environment and behavior. In other words, you could achieve a complete understanding of why individuals in these populations varied and miss the most important public health question, which is, why is hypertension absent in Kenyans and common in Londoners? The answer to that question, Rose argued, had nothing to do with the characteristics of individuals. It had to do with some kind of force acting on the population as a whole, shifting the distribution, like you see here, one direction or the other. So his paper provoked considerable soul-searching among epidemiologists, kind of about their mission. Did they want to explain why one individual became ill or stayed healthy? Or did they want to understand and prevent a disease in populations? Today, I'd argue that mHealth faces this very same decision. Are we going to be content to follow approaches that help us improve day-to-day management and quality of life? Or can we achieve something more significant and meaningful, which is actually the eradication of some of these diseases from the population? So I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about some of the puzzling data and questions in asthma epidemiology that I think illustrate this point well, and also and highlight how we can build mHealth applications that get us there. So over the years that I've been working on asthma, the prevalence has risen basically uniformly and in nearly every population in the world where it's been measured, until recently. This year, Statistics Canada reported that prevalence of asthma among young children had fallen to its lowest level in 10 years. During the same period in the United States, we saw a stabilization in prevalence and then a return to a significant increase among kids. So these changing and contrary trends in the epidemiology really flummoxed a lot of us. We just sort of, when we thought that we had the evidence and the theoretical framework to explain what was essentially a really long rise in asthma cases, now we have to suddenly explain why, in one population we're witnessing a decline, and in a neighboring population, which is arguably not that different, stabilization and then a return to an increase. So the official reports from Stats Canada pinned it on a couple of things: improvements in air quality and reductions in exposure to tobacco smoke. But the situation in asthma epi is way more complex than that. And unfortunately, Stats Canada kind of got it wrong. At least they got it wrong in a way that actually productively highlights this distinction between the causes of disease in individuals and the causes in populations. The key difference hinges on this: two types of risk factors. Stats Canada and most of public health right now is focused on secondary risk factors, things that determine who in a population will develop a disease, what Rose called the causes of variance. This is in contrast to primary risk factors, things that determine the overall level of asthma in a population, or whatever disease in a population, or Rose's causes of incidence. Tobacco smoke is a good example. We know that exposure to tobacco smoke when you're young actually significantly increases the odds that you're going to develop asthma. But we also know that tobacco smoke exposure can't be responsible for the epidemic of asthma, because that occurred during times when the population prevalence of smoking was falling from 35% to 21%. Air pollution's the same story. Air quality improved across most of Canada during the same period when rates of asthma were increasing. So it should be clear that there's important risk factors that determine whether or not a given individual develops a disease, but these are not and cannot be causative factors in the epidemic of asthma overall in the population, because they demonstrate counter trends at the population level. It's natural for patients, physicians, and public health to assume that things that cause disease in individuals should be relevant and important for the population. But unfortunately, for most of those things, the evidence for their role in primary causation is pretty weak. By and large, they were discovered on the basis of clinical reports and case studies of exacerbations in asthma patients. And that strategy, that focus on secondary risk factors, has left us totally puzzled. The Lancet recently summarized the state of asthma research as slow and confusing, with many contradictory findings. The harder we've looked, the more questions have arisen. It's also left us with a public health strategy that's essentially palliative and temporary. We have to continually focus on identifying and protecting the most susceptible individuals in the population, and they will always be there. Instead, we need to figure out a way to address the underlying risk factors of the disease in the population and make asthma and these other things less common in the first place. So patients and physicians focus on the salient things they can modify, and that really guarantees that they're going to pay attention to secondary risk factors. Rose actually predicted this. He warned that patients and physicians were not motivated or even capable of understanding the underlying risk factors of disease in a population. And in most cases, those things aren't even evident until you sum them up across the population. So far, mHealth has been paying attention to exactly what's on the minds of patients and physicians. But for us to win, mHealth really has to change that. And one of the most important ways they can do that is by helping us collect vastly more data than we've ever had before. Consider the public health surveillance approach to asthma. For most of the last few decades, we've been focused on collecting information about a tiny fraction of the events that could potentially be informative. This most severe exacerbations that cause hospitalizations and ER visits. It's something like 38,000 events per week. By contrast, we model that there's about 40 to 50 million uses of an inhaler every week in the United States, all of them readily capturable and analyzable with distributed networks of sensors and connected devices. These new bottom-up approaches to public health really give us an opportunity to bring the daily experiences of many, many more people, health, disease, environment, diet, social behavior, et cetera, under increasing statistical scrutiny. And it gives us just so many more shots on goal at identifying these underlying primary risk factors. Even then, it's still going to be a challenge. The hardest cause to identify is the one that's universally distributed, because then it has no influence on the distribution of cases. So here's an example from Rose of cardiovascular mortality and the overall softness of the public water supply. Rose showed that in Scotland, which is what you see here, where everybody's water is soft, there's basically no discernible relationship. The possibly adverse effect only becomes evident when you extend the study to areas where there's a greater variation in exposure. In the case of, let me give you another example. If everybody smoked 20 cigarettes, then every tool we have, case control studies, clinical studies, cohort studies, would all suggest that lung cancer was a genetic disease. And in fact, they would be kind of right, because if the exposure to the necessary agent is uniform across the population, then all that determines the distribution of cases is the individual's susceptibility. In the case of asthma and some of these other chronic diseases, we have to consider that it might be too late to search for these primary risk factors among the urban population of rich countries. Sorry. But fortunately, I think in those populations, the exposure to the primary risk factor may already be ubiquitous across the population, and then all you're left with are the effects of secondary risk factors. Fortunately, I think this is one of the things that mHealth is best suited to address. But we can't be content to let our tools be used by a demographic fraction of the population. With billions of people now owning smartphones and mobile phones and smartphone prevalence increasing, we have this opportunity to engage many more and many different types of people. Populations that really vary in prevalence, that vary in exposure, populations that abruptly change their lifestyle and environment. We have this opportunity to carry out international comparisons. And these kinds of cross-cultural experiments have a much greater probability of helping us understand the primary risk factors underlying the cause of these diseases. Yet they remain extraordinarily rare in mHealth. So mHealth finds itself facing this unappreciated, unrecognized, but potentially hugely significant role in some of the most challenging problems we face in chronic disease. We can and we should be focusing on improving day-to-day management, improving quality of life, and preventing disease in individuals. But we should also aim for a really significant victory. We should embrace epidemiology and this hunt for primary risk factors, and control the determinants of incidence, lower the mean level of risk factors, and finally shift these populations in a favorable direction. And that, I think, is what sets the goalposts in the game where they belong. Thanks a lot.